The great hall of Thornfield Manor had never witnessed such a spectacle. What should have been a celebration of matrimony had devolved into something far more sinister, a public humiliation disguised as a wedding ceremony. Lady Eliza Whitmore stood at the altar, her 18-year-old frame trembling beneath layers of ivory silk that felt more like a shroud than a bridal gown. Her eyes, once bright with dreams of love and adventure, were now fixed firmly on the marble floor, as if she could disappear into its cold patterns and escape the nightmare her life had become. The whispers started before the ceremony even began. They rippled through the assembled nobility like poison through water, each murmur more vicious than the last. The ton had gathered not to witness a union of hearts, but to observe the final act of a scandal that had rocked London society for months. Eliza Whitmore, the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt earl, was being married off to Lord Reginald Blackthorne, a man 30 years her senior, known for his cruelty and his collection of young wives who had all met mysterious ends. But this was not a story of helpless resignation. This was the moment when fate would intervene in the form of Adrian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenshollow, a man whose single sentence would shatter the carefully constructed facade of propriety and reveal the corruption that festered beneath society's glittering surface. His words would not only save a young woman from a living hell, but would also expose the true nature of those who called themselves her betters. In that instant, everything would change. Reputations built over generations would crumble, alliances forged in greed would shatter, and a young woman who had never expected to be defended would discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected quarters, wearing the face of a duke who valued justice above social convention. Follow this tale of courage and redemption, where one man's refusal to remain silent transforms humiliation into triumph and proves that true nobility lies not in birth, but in the courage to stand for what is right. The story began 6 months earlier, in the cramped study of Whitmore House, where the remnants of a once proud family fortune lay scattered across a mahogany desk in the form of unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, and letters from increasingly impatient creditors. Earl Whitmore sat hunched over these documents like a man studying his own death warrant, his greying hair disheveled and his once proud bearing reduced to the desperate posture of a man who had gambled away everything his ancestors had built. Eliza had entered the study that morning, expecting to discuss her upcoming presentation to society, perhaps to plan the modest debut that their reduced circumstances would allow. Instead, she found her father in the company of Lord Reginald Blackthorne, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of decay. Blackthorne was known throughout London as a collector, not of art or books, but of young wives who seemed to have a disturbing tendency to die young and leave him their inheritances. "Ah, Eliza," her father had said without looking up from his papers, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had already sold his soul. "Come in, my dear. Lord Blackthorne and I have been discussing your future." Eliza had felt a chill run down her spine as Blackthorne's pale eyes assessed her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating livestock. He was tall and thin, with the kind of aristocratic features that might have been handsome on a younger man, but had been twisted by years of cruelty into something predatory. His smile, when it came, revealed teeth that were too white and too sharp like a wolf's. "Lady Eliza," Blackthorne had said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a serpent, "you have grown into quite the beauty. Your father and I have reached an understanding that I believe will benefit all parties involved." "What sort of understanding?" Eliza had asked, though she already suspected the answer would shatter what remained of her world. "A marriage contract," her father had replied, still unable to meet her eyes. "Lord Blackthorne has graciously agreed to settle our debts in exchange for your hand in marriage. The ceremony will take place in 6 months' time." The words had hit Eliza like physical blows. Marriage to Blackthorne, a man old enough to be her father, whose previous 3 wives had all died under mysterious circumstances. The rumors about him were whispered in drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike, that he was cruel to his wives, that he kept them virtual prisoners in his estate, that he had ways of making inconvenient spouses disappear when he tired of them. "Father, surely there must be another way," Eliza had pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps if we sold more of the estate, or if I found employment—" "Employment?" Blackthorne had laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "My dear child, ladies of your breeding do not seek employment. You will be my wife and you will fulfill the duties that such a position entails. Your father has already signed the contracts. The matter is settled, Eliza," her father had said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You will marry Lord Blackthorne, and you will do so with grace and gratitude. It is the only way to preserve what remains of our family's honor." But Eliza had known even then that there was no honor in selling one's daughter to pay gambling debts. There was only desperation, cowardice, and the kind of moral bankruptcy that no amount of money could cure. She had left the study that day, feeling as though she were already dead, her future as fixed and inevitable as a gravestone. The months that followed had passed in a blur of wedding preparations that felt more like funeral arrangements. Eliza had been fitted for her gown, like a corpse being prepared for burial, had endured endless lectures from her father about her duties as a wife, and had watched helplessly as the last remnants of her childhood were packed away to make room for her new life as Lady Blackthorne. The few friends she had possessed had gradually distanced themselves as news of her engagement spread, some out of embarrassment at her family's reduced circumstances, others out of fear of being associated with Blackthorne's dark reputation. Only her maid, Sarah, had remained loyal, though even she could do little more than offer silent sympathy and the occasional kind word. "Miss Eliza," Sarah had said one evening as she helped her mistress prepare for bed, perhaps Lord Blackthorne is not as bad as people say. Perhaps the rumors are just gossip." But Eliza had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes, had heard the tremor in her voice. Even her loyal maid knew that she was being sent to her doom, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it. As the wedding day approached, Eliza had found herself retreating further and further into herself, speaking only when spoken to, moving through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. She had stopped reading, stopped playing the piano, stopped doing any of the things that had once brought her joy. What was the point when everything she loved would soon be taken from her? The night before the wedding, she had stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the London streets, and wondering if she had the courage to simply walk away. She could disappear into the city, find work as a seamstress or a governess, live in poverty, but in freedom. But she knew that such thoughts were futile. Her father's debts would follow her wherever she went, and Blackthorne was not the sort of man to accept being thwarted. He would find her, and when he did, her punishment would be severe. So she had resigned herself to her fate, had spent her last night of freedom staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future that held anything other than misery and fear. She had failed. The morning of the wedding had dawned grey and cold, as if the very sky were mourning what was about to take place. Eliza had been dressed by Sarah and her mother's old lady's maid, both women working in grim silence as they transformed her into a bride. The gown was beautiful. Blackthorne had spared no expense in ensuring that his new acquisition would be properly displayed, but it felt like a costume for a role she had never wanted to play. Her father had come to escort her to the church, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he offered her his arm. "Eliza," he had said quietly, "I know this is not what you would have chosen. But sometimes we must sacrifice our own desires for the greater good of the family." "And what about my good, father?" she had asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "What about my happiness, my safety, my life?" "You will learn to be content," he had replied, but his words carried no conviction. "Lord Blackthorne is a wealthy man. You will want for nothing." "Except freedom," Eliza had said, "except choice, except love." Her father had not answered, and they had made the journey to Thornfield Manor in silence. Now, standing at the altar with her eyes fixed on the floor, Eliza could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes upon her. The cream of London society had gathered to witness her humiliation, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that made people slow their carriages to stare at accidents. They whispered behind their fans and gloved hands, their voices creating a constant buzz of malicious gossip. "Poor child," she heard Lady Pemberton murmur to her companion, "sold like a broodmare to pay her father's gambling debts." "Well, what did she expect?" came the sharp reply from Lady Ashworth. "The Whitmores have been living beyond their means for years. This is simply the natural consequence of their improvidence." "Still," Lady Pemberton continued, "to marry her to Blackthorne, we all know what happened to his previous wives." "Accidents," Lady Ashworth said primly. "Tragic accidents, nothing more. Though I must say, the man does seem to have remarkably bad luck with his spouses." The conversation was interrupted by a burst of cruel laughter from a group of young men near the back of the hall. Eliza recognized the voice of Lord Pemberton's eldest son, a wastrel known for his gambling and his vicious tongue. "I give her 6 months," he was saying to his companions. "That's longer than the last one lasted." "You're being generous," replied another voice. "I say 3 months, sir. She looks too delicate for Blackthorne's tastes." "Gentlemen, please," came a third voice, though it carried more amusement than reproach. "We shouldn't speak so freely about such matters. After all, accidents are unpredictable things." More laughter followed, and Eliza felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. These people, her supposed social equals, were discussing her future death as if it were a sporting event, placing bets on how long she would survive as Blackthorn's wife. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, even by the standards of a society that prided itself on its refinement. Lord Blackthorn stood beside her at the altar, resplendent in his wedding finery, and radiating the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from acquiring a particularly prized possession. He had not spoken to her since they had taken their positions, but she could feel his presence like a shadow, dark and oppressive and inescapable. The priest, a nervous little man who had clearly been well paid for his services, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice shook slightly as he spoke the ancient words, as if he too understood the true nature of what was taking place. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Lord Reginald Blackthorn and Lady Eliza Whitmore in holy matrimony." The words washed over Eliza like a tide of despair. Holy matrimony. There was nothing holy about this transaction, nothing sacred about selling a young woman to a monster to pay debts incurred by gambling and poor judgment. She felt as though she were drowning, pulled under by forces beyond her control. If anyone present knows of any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined in marriage, the priest continued, his voice gaining strength as he approached the familiar formula, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza had not expected anyone to object. Who would dare to challenge Blackthorn publicly? But the absence of even a single voice raised in her defense felt like the final nail in her coffin. She was truly alone, abandoned by everyone who might have helped her. But then, just as the priest was about to continue with the ceremony, a voice rang out from the back of the hall. It was clear and strong and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I object." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Fans snapped shut, and every head turned toward the source of the interruption. Even Eliza looked up for the first time since the ceremony began, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Standing at the back of the hall, still wearing his traveling clothes and covered in the dust of a hard ride, was Adrian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenshollow. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively step aside. His grey eyes swept the crowd with obvious contempt before settling on Blackthorn with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Your Grace," Blackthorn said, his voice tight with anger at the interruption, "this is a private ceremony. You have no business here." "On the contrary," the Duke replied, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the hall, "I have every business here. I cannot stand by and watch an innocent young woman be sacrificed to pay her father's debts. The marriage contract has been signed," Blackthorn said, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "The matter is legally settled." "Contracts signed under duress are invalid," the Duke replied calmly, "and I would hardly call threatening a family with financial ruin, unless they surrender their daughter, anything other than duress." A murmur ran through the crowd at this exchange. The Duke's words were not just a challenge to Blackthorn, they were an indictment of the entire system that allowed such transactions to take place. Several of the assembled nobles shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in similar arrangements. "You speak of matters you do not understand," Blackthorn said, his voice rising slightly. "The girl's father owes substantial debts. I'm providing a solution that benefits everyone involved." "Everyone except the girl herself," the Duke said, his gaze shifting to Eliza for the first time. When their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that she had not seen from anyone else in months, genuine concern for her welfare. "The girl will be well cared for as my wife," Blackthorn insisted. "She will want for nothing." "Except freedom," the Duke said, echoing Eliza's own words from that morning. "Except choice, except the right to determine her own future." "Rights?" Blackthorn laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "She is 18 years old and the daughter of a bankrupt earl. What rights does she have beyond those granted to her by marriage?" It was then that the Duke spoke the sentence that would be remembered long after the events of that day had passed into legend. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hall with perfect clarity. "She has the right to be treated as a human being, rather than a commodity to be bought and sold." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the assembled crowd. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The simple statement had cut through all the elaborate justifications and social conventions to expose the brutal truth of what was taking place. Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of despair but tears of gratitude. Here, finally, was someone who saw her as more than a pawn in other people's games, someone who recognized her fundamental humanity. The Duke's words had given voice to everything she had felt, but had been unable to express. "How dare you?" Blackthorne snarled, his composure finally cracking. "How dare you come into my wedding and make such accusations?" "I dare because someone must," the Duke replied, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath the surface. "I dare because I have seen what happens to young women who are forced into marriages with men like you." "Men like me?" Blackthorne's face was flushed with rage now. "I am a peer of the realm, a man of impeccable breeding and substantial fortune. You are a predator," the Duke said bluntly, "a man who preys on the desperation of others to satisfy his own twisted desires. How many wives have you buried, Blackthorne? 3, 4. Do you think the rest of us are blind to the pattern?" A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The Duke had just publicly accused Blackthorne of murder, an accusation that, while whispered in private, had never been voiced so directly in public. The implications were staggering. "You go too far, Ravenshollow," Blackthorne said, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "I will not stand for such slander." "Then challenge me," the Duke said simply. "Call me out if you dare. But first answer my question. How many wives have you buried?" Blackthorne's face went white, then red, then white again. He was trapped, and everyone in the hall knew it. If he challenged the Duke to a duel, he would be admitting that the accusation had merit. If he did not, he would appear weak and guilty. Either way, his reputation was in ruins. "The deaths of my previous wives were tragic accidents," he said finally, his voice barely controlled. "I loved each of them dearly." "Loved them to death, one might say," the Duke replied with cold irony. "Tell me, Blackthorne, what sort of accident befell your second wife, the one who was found at the bottom of the stairs, with bruises that suggested she had been beaten before she fell?" The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The Duke was systematically destroying Blackthorne's reputation, exposing secrets that had been carefully hidden behind wealth and social position. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing," Blackthorne said desperately. "These are nothing but malicious rumors spread by my enemies." "Perhaps," the Duke agreed. "But I have no intention of allowing you to add another young woman to your collection of tragic accidents." He turned to address the priest, who had been standing frozen throughout the exchange. "Father, I believe you have your answer to the question of lawful impediment. This marriage cannot proceed." "Now see here," Earl Whitmore interjected, speaking for the first time since the Duke's arrival. "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern, but the contracts have been signed. My family's honor depends on this union." "Your family's honor?" The Duke turned his withering gaze on Eliza's father. "You speak of honor while selling your daughter to a man you know to be dangerous. What honor is there in sacrificing your child to pay your gambling debts?" Earl Whitmore flinched as if he had been struck. "The debts must be paid. If not through this marriage, then how?" "I will pay them," the Duke said simply. The words hit the crowd like another thunderbolt. The Duke of Ravenshollow was one of the wealthiest men in England, but the casual way he offered to assume another man's debts was still shocking. You would do that?" Earl Whitmore stammered. "But why? What do you gain from such generosity?" "I gain the satisfaction of knowing that an innocent young woman will not be sacrificed to your poor judgment," the Duke replied. "I gain the knowledge that I have prevented a great injustice from taking place." "And what surety do I have that you will honor such a promise?" Earl Whitmore asked, hope beginning to creep into his voice. The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I have here a bank draft for the full amount of your debts, plus enough additional funds to allow your family to live comfortably while you rebuild your fortune through honest means rather than gambling." He handed the portfolio to Earl Whitmore, who opened it with trembling hands. The man's face went white as he saw the sum written on the bank draft. This is far more than I owe," he whispered. "Consider the excess a dowry for your daughter," the Duke said, "so that when she chooses to marry, and I emphasize the word chooses, she will not be dependent on her husband's generosity for her security." Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief and gratitude. The Duke had not only saved her from a nightmare marriage, but had done so in a way that preserved her family's financial security and her own future independence. It was more than she had dared to hope for, but Blackthorne was not finished. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation, and he was clearly not prepared to accept defeat gracefully. "This is not over, Ravenshollow," he snarled. You may have won this battle, but you have made a powerful enemy today. I already had a powerful enemy, the Duke replied calmly. The difference is that now everyone knows what you truly are. Blackthorn's hand went to his sword again, and for a moment it seemed as though he might actually draw it in the middle of the church. But then he seemed to remember where he was and who was watching, and his hand fell back to his side. You will regret this interference, he said, his voice low and venomous. Both of you will regret it. The only thing I regret, the Duke said, is that it took me so long to arrive. If I had been here sooner, this farce would never have gotten as far as it did. With that, Blackthorn turned on his heel and stalked from the church, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Several of his supporters followed him, but many of the assembled nobles remained, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to leave. The priest, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout the exchange, finally found his voice. Your Grace, what should I do? The ceremony. The ceremony is over, the Duke said firmly. There will be no marriage today. He turned to Eliza, who was still standing at the altar in her wedding gown, tears streaming down her face. But these were tears of joy and relief, not despair. Lady Eliza, he said gently, you are free. The choice of your future is now yours to make. Eliza tried to speak, but found that words failed her. Instead, she sank into a deep curtsy, the traditional gesture of gratitude from a lady to a gentleman who had performed a great service. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for being worth saving, the Duke replied, offering her his arm. Now shall we leave this place? I believe you have had quite enough of churches for one day. As they walked down the aisle together, the assembled crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. Some faces showed admiration for the Duke's courage, others showed shock at the day's revelations, and still others showed the calculating look of people already planning how to use this scandal to their own advantage. But Eliza saw none of this. She was focused entirely on the man beside her, the stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel to rescue her from a fate worse than death. She did not yet know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she had hope. The Duke had given her something precious beyond measure, the right to choose her own destiny, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of such a gift. The scandal of the interrupted wedding spread through London society like wildfire. Within hours of the dramatic confrontation at Thornfield Manor, every drawing room in Mayfair was buzzing with gossip about the Duke of Ravenshallow's extraordinary intervention and the shocking accusations he had levelled against Lord Blackthorn. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Earl Whitmore, clutching the Duke's bank draft like a lifeline, had retreated to his study to contemplate the sudden reversal of his family's fortunes. Lady Whitmore, who had been conspicuously absent from the wedding ceremony, emerged from her chambers to find her daughter free, and her husband's debts mysteriously paid by a man she had never met. Eliza herself was in a state of emotional exhaustion. The relief of her rescue was so overwhelming that she could barely process what had happened. Sarah, her loyal maid, had helped her out of the wedding gown and into a simple day dress, but even this mundane task felt surreal after the morning's dramatic events. Miss Eliza, Sarah said as she carefully hung the wedding dress in the wardrobe, I can hardly believe it. When that Duke spoke up, I thought my heart would stop beating. I know the feeling, Eliza replied, sinking into a chair by the window. Sarah, do you think it's real? Do you think I'm truly free? The Duke seemed very certain of himself, Sarah said. And Lord Blackthorn left without you, didn't he? I'd say you're as free as you've ever been. But freedom, Eliza was discovering, came with its own complications. She had spent months preparing herself mentally for a life of subjugation and fear. Now, suddenly presented with the prospect of choosing her own future, she found herself paralyzed by the enormity of the possibilities. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, expecting to see her mother or perhaps her father come to discuss the day's events. Instead, a footman entered with a calling card on a silver tray. Lady Eliza, the Duke of Ravenshollow is here to see you. He's waiting in the drawing room. Eliza's heart began to race. She had not expected to see the Duke again so soon, if ever. Their dramatic encounter at the church had felt like something out of a fairy tale, the kind of story where the hero rescues the princess and then disappears back into legend. Tell His Grace I'll be down directly, she said, rising from her chair and checking her appearance in the mirror. She looked pale and tired, but there was a light in her eyes that had been absent for months. The Duke was standing by the window when she entered the drawing room, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. He had changed from his travel-stained clothes into a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue wool, and his dark hair had been combed back from his face. He looked every inch the powerful nobleman he was, yet there was something approachable about his manner that put Eliza at ease. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "Lady Eliza," he replied, turning from the window with a slight smile. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to ensure that you were well after this morning's events." "I am well," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Thanks entirely to you. Your Grace, I don't know how to express my gratitude for what you did today." "No gratitude is necessary," the Duke said gently. "I simply did what any decent person should have done in such circumstances." "But you were the only one who did it," Eliza pointed out. "There were hundreds of people in that church, and you were the only one who spoke up for me." The Duke's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, well, I'm afraid that says more about our society than I would like. Too many people are willing to stand by and watch injustice occur, as long as it doesn't directly affect them." "Why did you come?" Eliza asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment he had appeared in the church. "I mean, what brought you to the wedding? We had never met before today." The Duke was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "I had heard rumors about the marriage," he said finally. "Whispers in my club about Blackthorn's latest acquisition, speculation about how long you would last as his wife. The casual cruelty of it sickened me." "But surely you hear such gossip all the time in London society," Eliza said. "What made this different?" "Because I knew it was true," the Duke replied, his voice heavy with old pain. "I see, Lady Eliza. I knew Blackthorn's second wife. Lady Catherine was a friend of my sister's, a gentle soul who deserved far better than the fate that befell her." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. You think he murdered her?" "I know he did," the Duke said bluntly. "Oh, it was made to look like an accident and there was no legal proof. But Catherine had confided in my sister about the abuse she suffered, the threats Blackthorn made when she displeased him. When she died, my sister was devastated. She blamed herself for not doing more to help." "I'm so sorry," Eliza whispered. "That must have been terrible for both of you." "It was a lesson in the consequences of inaction," the Duke said. "I swore then that if I ever had the opportunity to prevent another young woman from suffering Catherine's fate, I would not hesitate. When I heard about your situation, I knew I had to act. Even though you didn't know me, innocence doesn't require personal acquaintance to be worth protecting," the Duke said simply. "Besides, I had heard good things about you from mutual acquaintances. Your reputation for kindness and intelligence preceded you." Eliza felt herself blushing at the compliment. "I fear my reputation is somewhat tarnished now. The scandal of today's events will be forgotten within a month," the Duke assured her. "Society has a remarkably short memory for anything that doesn't directly affect their own interests. And those who matter, those whose opinions are worth having, will remember only that you were the victim in this affair, not the cause." "What about Lord Blackthorn?" Eliza asked. "He seemed very angry when he left. Do you think he'll cause trouble?" The Duke's expression hardened. "Blackthorn is a coward who preys on the weak and defenseless. Now that his true nature has been exposed publicly, he'll find it much harder to find victims. As for causing trouble, let him try. I'm not easily intimidated. But surely he has friends, allies who might support him." "Fewer than he had this morning," the Duke said with grim satisfaction. "Blackthorn's power came from his ability to hide his true nature behind a facade of respectability. That facade has been shattered. Oh, he'll still have some supporters, men who share his proclivities or who owe him money, but his influence in society has been severely damaged." They were interrupted by the arrival of Earl Whitmore, who entered the drawing room looking both relieved and deeply ashamed. He had aged years in the space of a few hours, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. "Your Grace," he said, bowing deeply to the Duke, "I cannot begin to express my gratitude for your intervention today. You have saved not only my daughter, but my entire family from ruin." "I'm glad I could help," the Duke replied politely, though his tone was noticeably cooler than it had been when speaking to Eliza. "I trust the financial arrangements are satisfactory." "More than satisfactory," Earl Whitmore said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your Grace, the amount you have provided, it's far more than necessary to clear my debts. I don't understand why you would be so generous to a stranger. Consider it an investment in your daughter's future," the Duke said. "Lady Eliza deserves the security of knowing that she will never again be used as collateral for her family's financial difficulties." Earl Whitmore flinched at the rebuke, but accepted it without protest. You are right, of course. What I did, what I almost did to Eliza, it was unforgivable. The important thing is that you recognize that now, the Duke said, and that you ensure it never happens again. It won't, Earl Whitmore said firmly. I give you my word as a gentleman that my gambling days are over. I will use your generous gift to rebuild our family's fortunes through legitimate means, and Eliza will never again be subjected to such treatment. See that you keep that promise, the Duke said, because if you don't, you'll answer to me. The threat was delivered quietly, but there was no mistaking its sincerity. Earl Whitmore nodded quickly, clearly understanding that he had been given a second chance that would not be repeated if he squandered it. Your Grace, Earl Whitmore said hesitantly, might I ask, what are your intentions regarding my daughter? I mean no offense, but your intervention today, your generosity, it suggests a level of interest that goes beyond mere charity. Eliza felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her father's blunt question, but the Duke seemed unperturbed. My intentions are entirely honorable, he said calmly. I have no designs on Lady Eliza beyond ensuring her safety and freedom. She has been through a traumatic experience today, and she deserves time to recover and decide her own future without pressure from anyone, including me. Of course, Your Grace, Earl Whitmore said quickly. I meant no implication of impropriety. It's just that, well, your actions today have been so extraordinary that I wondered. I acted as any decent person should act when confronted with injustice, the Duke said firmly. Nothing more, nothing less. Lady Eliza's future is her own to determine. But even as he spoke these words, Eliza noticed that his gaze lingered on her face, and she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The Duke was undeniably attractive, both physically and in terms of his character. His intervention today had revealed a man of principle and courage, qualities that were all too rare in her experience. Your Grace, she said impulsively, would you consider staying for tea? I know it's presumptuous of me to ask, but I would very much like to hear more about your sister and Lady Catherine. I feel as though I owe her memory a debt of gratitude. The Duke's expression softened at her request. I would be honored to stay, Lady Eliza. Catherine would have liked you, I think. You have the same gentle strength that she possessed. As Earl Whitmore excused himself to attend to business matters, no doubt related to the Duke's generous financial settlement, Eliza found herself alone with the man who had saved her life. The drawing room, which had felt oppressive and confining during the months of her engagement, now seemed warm and welcoming. Tell me about your sister, Eliza said as they settled into comfortable chairs near the fireplace. Is she well? Margaret is married now with children of her own, the Duke said, his face lighting up with obvious affection. She lives in Scotland with her husband, far from the intrigues of London society. She's much happier there. And Lady Catherine, what was she like? The Duke was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. Catherine was luminous. That's the only word I can think of to describe her. She had this way of making everyone around her feel special, valued. She was kind without being naive, intelligent without being intimidating. She deserved so much better than what Blackthorn gave her. How did she come to marry him? Much the same way you nearly did, the Duke said grimly. Her family had financial difficulties and Blackthorn presented himself as the solution. Catherine was barely 19 when they married, younger even than you are now. What happened to her? Officially? She fell down the stairs and broke her neck. But Margaret told me that Catherine had confided her fears about Blackthorn's violent temper, his threats when she failed to please him. The night she died, the servants heard shouting from their chambers, then a scream, then silence. Eliza shuddered at the thought of how close she had come to sharing Catherine's fate. Why was nothing done? Surely if there were witnesses to his threats. The word of servants against a peer of the realm? The Duke shook his head. There was no evidence that would stand up in court, and Blackthorn was careful to ensure that his abuse left no visible marks. Catherine's death was ruled accidental, and Blackthorn inherited her substantial dowry. And then he went looking for another wife. Within 6 months, the Duke confirmed. His third wife lasted less than a year before she too suffered a fatal accident. That's when I began to pay closer attention to Blackthorn's activities. I was determined that he would not claim another victim. But he almost did, Eliza said quietly. If you hadn't arrived when you did, but I did arrive, the Duke said firmly, and you are safe. That's what matters now. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Eliza was struck by the strange turns her life had taken in the space of a single day. This morning she had been a condemned woman, resigned to a fate worse than death. Now she was free, sitting in her own drawing room with a duke who had risked his own reputation to save her. "Your Grace," she said finally, "what happens now? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words for what you've done, but I find myself somewhat at a loss. For months, my entire existence has been focused on preparing for marriage to Lord Blackthorne. Now that that future has been taken away, I'm not sure what to do with myself." "You have time to figure that out," the Duke said gently. "You're 18 years old, Lady Eliza. You have your entire life ahead of you. You can travel, pursue your interests, perhaps even fall in love with someone worthy of your affection. Is that what you would advise? That I should look for another husband?" The Duke considered her question carefully. "I would advise you to live your life for yourself, at least for a while. You've spent the last months under the threat of an unwanted marriage. Take some time to discover who you are when you're not living in fear. And if I decide that I do want to marry someday, then you'll do so by choice, to a man who values and respects you. Marriage should be a partnership between equals, not a transaction between a creditor and a debtor." Eliza found herself studying the Duke's face as he spoke. There was something in his expression, a wistfulness perhaps, that suggested his words came from personal experience. "Have you ever been married, Your Grace?" she asked, then immediately blushed at her own boldness. "Forgive me, that was impertinent." "Not at all," the Duke said with a slight smile. "And no, I have never married. I came close once, but circumstances intervened. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It was for the best, as it turned out. The lady in question was more interested in my title and fortune than in me personally. I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of genuine affection in marriage." "Is that why you've remained a bachelor? Because you haven't found someone who loves you for yourself?" The Duke's smile became more pronounced. "You ask very direct questions, Lady Eliza. I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry. It's just that, well, you saved my life today, and I find myself curious about the man who would do such a thing for a stranger." "I'm not sure I'm particularly interesting," the Duke said. "I manage my estates, attend to my duties in Parliament, and try to use my position to help others when I can. It's a comfortable life, if somewhat solitary. Don't you get lonely?" The question seemed to catch the Duke off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted finally. "But I've learned that it's better to be alone than to be with someone who doesn't truly care for you. I've seen too many marriages based on convenience or necessity to want to enter into such an arrangement myself. But surely not all marriages are like that. Surely some people do find genuine love." "Some do," the Duke agreed. "My sister Margaret, for instance, is very happy with her husband. They married for love, and it shows in everything they do together. But such matches are rare, especially among our class." "Why do you think that is?" "Because we're taught from birth that marriage is a business arrangement," the Duke said with obvious distaste. "Titles must be preserved, fortunes consolidated, bloodlines maintained. The idea that two people might actually care for each other is considered a pleasant bonus, not a requirement. That's rather cynical, isn't it?" "Perhaps, but it's also realistic. How many truly happy marriages do you know among your acquaintances?" Eliza considered the question and found that she couldn't think of many examples. Most of the married couples she knew seemed to live essentially separate lives, coming together only for social obligations and the production of heirs. "You make a good point," she said, "but surely that doesn't mean we should give up on the possibility of finding real love." "No," the Duke said, his voice softening as he looked at her. "We shouldn't give up on that possibility. But we should be very careful about who we trust with our hearts." There was something in his tone that made Eliza's pulse quicken. Was he speaking generally, or was there a more personal message in his words? She found herself hoping for the latter, even as she tried to remind herself that she had only just escaped one unwanted entanglement. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Earl Whitmore, who entered the drawing room with a tea service and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Your Grace, Lady Eliza," he said, setting down the tray with slightly shaking hands, "I've just received word from my solicitor. The bank draft you provided has been verified and deposited. Our debts are completely cleared, with a substantial sum remaining for future security." "I'm glad to hear it," the Duke said politely. "Your Grace, I must ask again, why have you been so generous? The amount you've provided goes far beyond what was necessary to prevent the marriage." The Duke glanced at Eliza before answering. "As I said before, I consider it an investment in Lady Eliza's future independence. No woman should ever again be placed in the position your daughter faced today. But surely you must want something in return. Some consideration for your generosity?" "The only thing I want," the Duke said firmly, "is your word that Lady Eliza will never again be used as a pawn in financial negotiations. Her future choices must be her own. "You have my word," Earl Whitmore said solemnly. "But, Your Grace, surely there's some way we can show our gratitude." The Duke was quiet for a moment, then turned to Eliza with an expression that was both hopeful and hesitant. "Actually," he said, "there is something. Lady Eliza, would you consider allowing me to escort you to Lady Pemberton's ball next week? I think it would be beneficial for you to be seen in society, to show that you have emerged from today's events with your reputation intact." Eliza felt her heart skip a beat. The Duke was asking to escort her to one of the season's most important social events. It would be a clear signal to society that she had his protection and approval. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But are you certain? Won't your association with me cause talk?" "Let them talk," the Duke said with a dismissive wave. "Anyone who matters will understand that you were the victim in today's affair, not the cause. And those who don't understand, well, their opinions are of no consequence." "Then yes," Eliza said, feeling a smile spread across her face for the first time in months. "I would very much like to attend the ball with you." As the Duke took his leave a short while later, promising to call again soon to discuss the arrangements for the ball, Eliza found herself in a state of cautious optimism that felt almost foreign after months of despair. She was free, her family's financial troubles were resolved, and she had the protection and apparent interest of one of England's most eligible bachelors. But even as she allowed herself to hope for a brighter future, she couldn't shake the memory of Lord Blackthorn's parting words. He had promised that both she and the Duke would regret their actions, and she had no doubt that he was a man who kept his promises, especially the unpleasant ones. The Duke had saved her from one danger, but Eliza couldn't help but wonder if, in doing so, he had exposed them both to an even greater threat. Blackthorn was not the sort of man to accept defeat gracefully, and his reputation for dealing with those who crossed him was as dark as his reputation with wives. But for now she was free, and that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she would allow herself to dream of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The Duke had given her back her future, and she was determined to make the most of it, whatever the cost. Lady Pemberton's ball was the social event of the season, an elaborate affair that brought together the cream of London society in a glittering display of wealth, power, and carefully orchestrated intrigue. The Pemberton mansion blazed with light from 1,000 candles, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the London night as carriages deposited their elegantly dressed passengers at the grand entrance. Eliza stood before her mirror, adjusting the delicate pearl necklace that had been her mother's wedding gift. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style that emphasized her graceful neck. For the first time in months, she felt beautiful, not because of her appearance, but because of the confidence that came from knowing she was attending the ball by choice, not obligation. "You look lovely, Miss Eliza," Sarah said, making final adjustments to the gown's train. "The Duke won't be able to take his eyes off you." "Sarah," Eliza said with a blush, "you shouldn't say such things." "Why not, when they're true?" Sarah replied with a smile. "That man looks at you like you're the only woman in the world. Mark my words, there'll be an announcement before the season's over." Eliza felt her heart flutter at the suggestion, but she tried to maintain her composure. "The Duke has been very kind to me, but I don't think we should read too much into his actions. He's a gentleman who saw someone in distress and acted accordingly." "If you say so, miss," Sarah said with obvious skepticism. "But I've never heard of a gentleman paying off another man's debts just to help a stranger." Before Eliza could respond, a footman appeared at her door to announce that the Duke had arrived. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and made her way downstairs to meet him. The Duke was waiting in the drawing room, resplendent in his evening clothes. His dark coat was perfectly tailored, his white cravat was tied with mathematical precision, and his dark hair was combed back to reveal the strong lines of his face. When he saw Eliza, his expression lit up with unmistakable admiration. "Lady Eliza," he said, bowing deeply, "you look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, dropping into a curtsy. "You're very kind." "I'm very honest," he corrected gently. "Are you ready for this evening? I know it may be difficult facing society so soon after recent events." "I'm ready," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. "I refuse to hide away as if I've done something wrong." "Excellent attitude," the Duke said approvingly. "Remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You were the victim in this affair, not the perpetrator." As they made their way to the Duke's carriage, Eliza couldn't help but notice the way the servants looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Word of the Duke's intervention at her wedding had spread throughout London's servant network, and she had become something of a celebrity among the working classes, who saw her rescue as a victory against the arbitrary power of the nobility. The ride to the Pemberton mansion was pleasant, filled with easy conversation about books, music, and current events. The Duke was an engaging companion, well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that made Eliza laugh despite her nervousness about the evening ahead. "Your Grace," she said, as they approached their destination, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you not concerned about the gossip that will result from your escorting me tonight? People will talk, and not all of it will be kind." The Duke's expression grew serious. "Lady Eliza, I learned long ago that it's impossible to prevent people from talking. The only thing you can control is whether you give them something worth talking about. Tonight, I want them to see that you have my protection and support. That should be enough to silence most of the malicious gossip. And if it doesn't, then we'll deal with whatever comes," he said simply. "But I don't think you'll find society as hostile as you fear. Most people are fundamentally decent, even if they don't always show it." The Duke's optimism proved to be well-founded, at least initially. When they arrived at the ball, they were greeted with curiosity rather than hostility. The Duke's presence at Eliza's side sent a clear message about her status, and most of the assembled guests were too well-bred to show open rudeness to someone under his protection. Lady Pemberton herself greeted them warmly, though Eliza noticed a calculating look in the older woman's eyes as she assessed the situation. "Your Grace, Lady Eliza," Lady Pemberton said with a gracious smile. "How wonderful to see you both. Lady Eliza, you look absolutely lovely. That shade of blue is perfect for your colouring." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Eliza replied. "You're very kind to say so." "Nonsense, my dear. I'm simply stating the obvious." Lady Pemberton turned to the Duke with obvious curiosity. "Your Grace, it's so good of you to escort Lady Eliza this evening. I'm sure she appreciates having such a distinguished protector." "The pleasure is entirely mine," the Duke replied smoothly. "Lady Eliza is charming company." As they moved into the ballroom, Eliza was struck by the magnificence of the scene before her. The room was decorated with thousands of flowers, and the light from the crystal chandeliers created a magical atmosphere that took her breath away. For a moment, she forgot about the whispers and stares, and simply enjoyed the beauty of the moment. The Duke led her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz, and Eliza found herself swept away by the music and the graceful movements of the dance. The Duke was an excellent dancer, guiding her effortlessly through the steps while maintaining a conversation that put her at ease. "You dance beautifully," he murmured as they turned together. "Have you always enjoyed dancing?" "I used to," Eliza replied, allowing herself to relax in his arms. Before everything changed, I had almost forgotten how wonderful it could feel. Then we must ensure you have many more opportunities to remember," the Duke said, his grey eyes warm with something that might have been affection. As the waltz ended and they made their way to the refreshment table, Eliza became aware of the conversations swirling around them. Most were complimentary: praise for her grace, admiration for her courage, speculation about her relationship with the Duke. But there were darker undercurrents as well, whispers about the scandal of the interrupted wedding, and questions about what had really transpired between her and Lord Blackthorne. "Lady Eliza," came a voice from behind her. She turned to find Lord Pemberton's eldest son, the same young man whose cruel laughter she had heard at the church. "How lovely to see you looking so recovered from your recent ordeal." There was something in his tone that made Eliza's skin crawl, a barely concealed malice that reminded her uncomfortably of Blackthorne himself. "Lord Pemberton," she replied coolly. "Thank you for your concern." "Oh, I'm not concerned," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the contrary. I find myself fascinated by the whole affair. Tell me, what was it like to be rescued at the altar? Rather like something out of a novel, wasn't it?" The Duke appeared at Eliza's side before she could respond, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. "Pemberton," he said with icy politeness, "I trust you're not troubling Lady Eliza with impertinent questions?" "Not at all, Your Grace," Pemberton replied, though his smile faltered slightly. "I was merely expressing my admiration for her resilience." "How thoughtful of you," the Duke said, his tone making it clear that he found nothing thoughtful about it at all. "I'm sure Lady Eliza appreciates your concern. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the next dance is beginning." As the Duke led her away, Eliza felt a wave of gratitude for his protection. "Thank you," she whispered. "He was making me very uncomfortable." "Young Pemberton has always been a fool," the Duke said dismissively. Pay him no mind, he's trying to curry favor with Blackthorn by causing you distress. Is Lord Blackthorn here tonight? Eliza asked, suddenly anxious. No, the Duke said firmly. I made certain of that. Lady Pemberton was given to understand that she could invite either Blackthorn or me to her ball, but not both. She chose wisely. Eliza felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She had been dreading the possibility of encountering Blackthorn in public, unsure how she would react to seeing the man who had so nearly destroyed her life. The evening continued pleasantly for the most part. Eliza danced with several gentlemen, all of whom treated her with perfect courtesy under the Duke's watchful eye. She began to relax, to enjoy herself, to feel like a normal young woman attending her first ball, rather than a scandal-ridden refugee from a disastrous marriage. But her peace was shattered when Lady Ashworth approached her during a brief intermission in the dancing. The older woman's face was set in lines of disapproval, and her voice carried clearly enough to be heard by several nearby guests. "Lady Eliza," she said with false sweetness, "how brave of you to appear in public so soon after your disappointment. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you looking so cheerful. Most young ladies would be devastated by such a public humiliation." Eliza felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "I'm sorry, Lady Ashworth, but I don't understand." "What humiliation?" "Why, being rejected at the altar, of course," Lady Ashworth replied with mock sympathy. "To have one's intended bridegroom simply walk away, it must have been mortifying." "That's not what happened," Eliza said quietly, aware that they were attracting attention from other guests. "Oh, my dear child," Lady Ashworth continued relentlessly, "there's no need to pretend. We all saw Lord Blackthorn leave the church without you. Whatever the Duke may have said about objecting to the marriage, the simple fact remains that your bridegroom chose not to marry you. One can hardly blame him, given your family's circumstances." The implication was clear and cruel. Lady Ashworth was suggesting that Blackthorn had rejected Eliza because of her family's financial troubles, painting her as a desperate fortune hunter who had been found wanting even by a man of questionable reputation. "Lady Ashworth," came the Duke's voice, cold as winter frost, "I believe you are labouring under a misapprehension about the events of last week." "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth said with a curtsy that was just barely respectful, "I'm simply stating what everyone saw with their own eyes." "What everyone saw," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet ballroom, "was me preventing an innocent young woman from being sacrificed to pay her father's gambling debts. What everyone saw was Lord Blackthorn revealed for the predator he truly is. If you choose to interpret those events differently, that says more about your character than about Lady Eliza's." A murmur ran through the assembled guests at this public rebuke. Lady Ashworth's face went white, then red, as she realized that the Duke had just publicly humiliated her in front of the cream of society. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, "I meant no offence. You were merely repeating malicious gossip." The Duke cut her off. "Lady Eliza is under my protection, and I will not tolerate any attempts to damage her reputation with lies and innuendo." "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Ashworth said, her voice barely controlled. "I apologize if my words were misunderstood." "They were not misunderstood," the Duke said bluntly. "They were simply inappropriate." As Lady Ashworth retreated with what dignity she could muster, Eliza found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted to be. The entire ballroom was watching her, waiting to see how she would react to the public confrontation. It was then that she made a decision that would define her for the rest of the evening, and perhaps for the rest of her life. Instead of shrinking away in embarrassment, instead of allowing herself to be cowed by the gossips and scandal-mongers, she lifted her chin and met the stares of the assembled nobility with quiet dignity. "Your Grace," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "would you honor me with another dance?" The Duke's face lit up with admiration and something that might have been pride. "The honor would be mine, Lady Eliza." As they took their positions for the quadrille, Eliza was aware of the whispered conversations around them, but this time the tone was different. Instead of malicious gossip, she heard admiration for her composure, respect for her courage, and speculation about her relationship with the Duke that was more hopeful than harmful. "That was magnificently done," the Duke murmured, as they moved through the figures of the dance. "You handled that situation with perfect grace." "I learned from watching you," Eliza replied. "You showed me that sometimes the best response to cruelty is simple dignity." "You have more than simple dignity," the Duke said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You have courage, intelligence, and a strength of character that puts most of these people to shame. As the dance ended, they were approached by Lady Margaret Thornton, one of society's most respected matrons, and a woman whose opinion carried considerable weight among the ton. "Lady Eliza," she said warmly, "I wanted to tell you how much I admire your composure this evening. It takes real strength to face down the gossips with such grace." "Thank you, Lady Thornton," Eliza replied. "You're very kind." "I'm very honest," Lady Thornton said, echoing the Duke's earlier words, "and I want you to know that there are many of us who understand exactly what happened last week and who admire the Duke's courage in intervening." "That's very reassuring to hear," Eliza said sincerely. "Your Grace," Lady Thornton continued, turning to the Duke, "I hope you'll bring Lady Eliza to my salon next week. I'm hosting a discussion on women's education, and I think she would have valuable insights to contribute." "I would be delighted to attend," Eliza said before the Duke could respond. "Thank you for the invitation." As Lady Thornton moved away, Eliza felt a surge of confidence. She was being accepted, not just tolerated, by the better elements of society. The Duke's protection had given her the breathing room she needed to establish herself as more than just a scandal-ridden victim. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, conversation, and gradually increasing acceptance. By the time the Duke escorted her home, Eliza felt as though she had passed some sort of test, proven herself worthy of the second chance she had been given. "Thank you," she said, as they stood in the drawing room of her family's house, "for everything. For saving me, for protecting me, for giving me the courage to face society again." "You didn't need me to give you courage," the Duke said gently. "You had it all along, you just needed the opportunity to show it." "Adrian," she said, using his given name for the first time, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why have you done all this for me? The financial assistance, the protection, escorting me tonight, it goes far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "Because," he said finally, "from the moment I saw you standing at that altar, so young and frightened and brave, I knew that I couldn't let anything happen to you. And the more I've come to know you, the more certain I've become that you are exactly the kind of woman I've been hoping to find my entire life." Eliza's heart began to race at his words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you," the Duke said simply. "I know it's too soon. I know you've been through a traumatic experience. I know that the last thing you probably want to think about is another marriage proposal, but I couldn't let another day pass without telling you how I feel." Eliza stared at him in amazement. "You love me, desperately," he said with a rueful smile. "I know it's presumptuous of me, given everything you've been through. I don't expect an answer now or even soon. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready to think about your future, I would be honored to be part of it." "Adrian," Eliza said, stepping closer to him, "you saved my life. You gave me back my freedom, my dignity, my future. How could I not love you in return?" The Duke's face lit up with hope and joy. "Do you mean that?" "I mean it with all my heart," Eliza said, reaching up to touch his face. "I love you, Adrian. I love your courage, your kindness, your integrity. I love the way you see the world and your determination to make it better." "Eliza," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "My darling Eliza." When he kissed her, it was with all the passion and tenderness of a man who had found his perfect match. Eliza responded with equal fervor, pouring all of her gratitude and love and hope for the future into that single, perfect moment. But their happiness was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the house, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. The Duke immediately stepped in front of Eliza, his hand moving to the sword at his side. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice taking on the authority of a man accustomed to command. The drawing-room door burst open, and Earl Whitmore stumbled in, his face pale with fear, and his clothes disheveled. "Eliza!" he gasped. "Thank God you're safe. We must leave immediately, all of us." "Father, what's wrong?" Eliza asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Blackthorn," Earl Whitmore said, confirming her fears. "He's here with a group of his men. They've surrounded the house. He says he's come to collect what's rightfully his." The Duke's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "How many men?" "At least a dozen," Earl Whitmore replied. "All armed. Your Grace, I'm sorry, but I think this is about more than just Eliza. I think Blackthorn means to kill you both." "Let him try," the Duke said grimly. "Eliza, is there another way out of the house?" "The servants' stairs lead to the kitchen, and there's a door to the garden from there," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good. I want you and your father to leave that way immediately. Go to my house. My servants will protect you." "I'm not leaving you," Eliza said firmly. Yes, you are, the Duke replied, his tone brooking no argument. This is exactly what Blackthorn wants, to force a confrontation where innocent people might be hurt. I won't give him that satisfaction. Adrian, please, Eliza pleaded, come with us. We can send for help. Bring the authorities. By the time help arrives, Blackthorn will be long gone, and he'll simply try again another time, the Duke said. No, this ends tonight. Their argument was cut short by the sound of the front door splintering open, followed by heavy footsteps in the hallway. Blackthorn's voice echoed through the house, cold and mocking. Ravenshollow, I know you're here. Come out and face me like a man instead of hiding behind a woman's skirts. The Duke's jaw tightened with anger. Stay here, he told Eliza and her father. No matter what happens, do not come out until this is over. Adrian, no, Eliza whispered, but he was already moving toward the door. Blackthorn, the Duke called out as he stepped into the hallway. I'm here. Let's finish this. Eliza crept to the door and peered out, her heart pounding with fear for the man she loved. She could see Blackthorn standing at the far end of the hallway, flanked by several rough-looking men who were obviously not gentlemen. His pale eyes glittered with malice as he faced the Duke. So good of you to join me, Ravenshollow, Blackthorn said with false courtesy. I've come to collect what you stole from me. I stole nothing, the Duke replied calmly. I simply prevented you from committing another murder. Murder? Blackthorn laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Such harsh words. I prefer to think of it as natural selection. The weak simply don't survive in my household. Like Lady Catherine didn't survive, the Duke asked, his voice deadly quiet. Catherine was clumsy, Blackthorn said with a shrug. She fell down the stairs. Tragic, really. After you beat her and threatened to kill her. Prove it, Blackthorn challenged. Oh, that's right. You can't. Just like you can't prove anything about my other wives. They all died of natural causes, perfectly legal and above board. But you and I both know the truth, the Duke said. The truth is irrelevant, Blackthorn replied. What matters is what can be proven in court. And what can be proven is that you interfered with a legal marriage contract, cost me a substantial dowry, and publicly humiliated me in front of all of London society. So you've come for revenge. I've come for satisfaction, Blackthorn corrected. You owe me a debt, Ravenshollow. The girl was mine by right, and you took her from me. I want compensation. What sort of compensation? Blackthorn's smile was like a blade. Your life. And then I'll take the girl anyway, and this time there will be no one to stop me. You're welcome to try, the Duke said, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Oh, I don't intend to fight you myself, Blackthorn said with amusement. That would be far too risky. No, I've brought some friends to handle that unpleasant task. The men flanking Blackthorn began to advance, and Eliza realized with horror that the Duke was outnumbered at least 6-1. Even if he was an excellent swordsman, the odds were impossible. But then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, the front door burst open again, and a group of men in the Duke's livery poured into the hallway. They were led by a tall, grizzled man who moved with the confidence of a veteran soldier. Your Grace, the man called out. We received your message and came as quickly as we could. The Duke's face showed relief, though he didn't take his eyes off Blackthorn. Excellent timing, Sergeant Morrison. As you can see, we have some uninvited guests. The odds had suddenly shifted dramatically. Blackthorn's men found themselves facing an equal number of trained fighters, and their confidence visibly wavered. This isn't over, Ravenshollow, Blackthorn snarled, backing toward the door. I'll have my satisfaction one way or another. If you come near Lady Eliza or her family again, the Duke said quietly, I'll kill you myself. And unlike your previous murders, there will be witnesses. Blackthorn's face went white with rage, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. With a gesture to his men, he retreated toward the door. You've made a powerful enemy tonight, he said as he reached the threshold. I already had a powerful enemy, the Duke replied, echoing his words from the church. The difference is that now everyone knows what you really are. After Blackthorn and his men had gone, Eliza rushed from the drawing room and threw herself into the Duke's arms. I thought he was going to kill you, she sobbed against his chest. I'm fine, the Duke said, holding her tightly. We're all fine, and Blackthorn won't be troubling us again. How can you be sure? Because his power came from operating in the shadows, from keeping his true nature hidden, the Duke explained. Tonight, in front of witnesses, he essentially confessed to murdering his previous wives. Sergeant Morrison and his men heard every word. Will that be enough to bring him to justice? It will be enough to destroy him socially and politically, the Duke said. And without those protections, his other crimes will eventually catch up with him. As the immediate danger passed, Eliza found herself thinking about what Blackthorn had said, that this wasn't over, that he would have his satisfaction. She had no doubt that he meant every word. "Adrian," she said quietly, "I'm frightened. Not for myself, but for you. Blackthorn won't give up easily." "Then we'll face whatever comes together," the Duke said firmly. "Eliza, will you marry me? Not because you need protection, not because you owe me anything, but because you love me and want to spend your life with me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you, Adrian, and I can't imagine my life without you." "Then we'll announce our engagement tomorrow," the Duke said, "and we'll be married as soon as the banns can be read. Once you're my wife, you'll have the full protection of my name and position. And you'll have my love and loyalty for the rest of our lives," Eliza promised. As they stood together in the hallway of her family's house, surrounded by the evidence of the night's violence, but safe in each other's arms, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a powerless young woman, sold into marriage to pay her father's debts. Tonight she was engaged to a duke who loved her for herself, protected by his strength and position, and looking forward to a future filled with hope and possibility. The road ahead would not be easy. Blackthorn's threats were real, and there would be other challenges to face. But she would face them with Adrian at her side, and that made all the difference in the world. The Duke had saved her life, but more than that, he had given her back her dignity, her freedom, and her future. And in return, she would give him her heart, her loyalty, and her unwavering love for all the days of their lives. If this tale of courage and love, where one man's refusal to remain silent transformed a young woman's fate and proved that true nobility lies in standing for what is right, has moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that love can triumph over the darkest circumstances? Would you have had the courage to speak up as the Duke did? Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories where justice prevails and proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty is a single voice raised in defense of the innocent. Thank you for joining us in this tale of transformation and redemption, and until our next romantic adventure unfolds, remember that true love is not just about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone worth fighting for.